Is that better? Okay. Thank you and welcome everyone to the Research Literacy Networking Zone. We're here today to talk about CAB for PrEP, and we have two esteemed colleagues, Sebastian Morin from the Medicines Patent Pool, who's the Policy and Advocacy Manager working on HIV and TB, and who focuses on Africa and Latin America. And Sean Mellers, who's the Director of Programs at the ViiV Positive Action Fund and has decades of experience working on community engagement and advocacy for people living with HIV. So thank you so much for being here with us. I know there's been a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion around CAB for PrEP at the conference. And I think one of the most exciting is the licensing agreement that ViiV and MPP have signed. And we wanted to really explore that a little bit more in depth, starting with what is a voluntary license and why is it so important? So I'll hand that question to you, Sebastian.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, and it's a pleasure to be here with Sean. So a voluntary license in short is basically a permission to bring in competition while patents exist, and patents are given for molecules that are country specific and they run for normally 20 years. And so for example, for cabotegravir, some of the patents go until 2031. And so the permission that we got with ViiV is that basically there's going to be something around a bit more than 90 countries. So there's a list of 90 countries where generic products, so generic versions that will be developed in the next couple of years, will be able to enter the market in advance. So there's going to be kind of more affordable and more speedy uptake of this product by bringing competition across multiple manufacturers. And so for this to happen, basically, this is a voluntary mechanism. And so we need that relationship with the company and build that trust on priority products. So the ones that the community wants, and then we try to negotiate and come to a common understanding, which in the end means that we have, kind of separated between the commercial interests and the public health ones. And so happy to discuss a bit more about the details of the license for cabotegravir, but that's in short the kind of the model.
Sean, would you like to add anything to that, or?
I suppose I would just emphasize the importance of the achievement, and I think how quickly MPP and ViiV Healthcare managed to pull it off. And I think it demonstrates the commitment of both MPP and ViiV Healthcare to make sure that the product becomes available as quickly as possible to as many people who want to choose it as a prevention option.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you describe a little bit more about what countries will be eligible to have generic access and how quickly you foresee that happening?
Yes, so the territory, so the list of countries in that license basically are all the sub-Saharan African countries, all the least developed, all the low income, and all the lower middle income countries. So this is based on World Bank definition. It makes 90 countries in total. And then what the license does, it's pretty much the same as we've done with ViiV for dolutegravir. There's a permission or flexibility that allows sales or supply of the products outside that list if there are no patent being infringed, or if there's any kind of TRIPS flexibility. So this is basically, government deciding that they will use, even though there's a patent. And so all of that means that there's a number of countries that will get access on top of the list. So for example, for the dolutegravir, there's 99 countries in 2 or 3 different licenses that are listed. And then on top of that, there's a number of countries that can access because there was no patent. And in reality, so far we've had DTG-based products in 122 countries, 35 of which are upper middle income countries. So there's the list, and then there's this kind of flexibility that is compatible with international law and the TRIPS flexibilities under WTO. So that's for the territory. Now, in terms of the next step, what we've done when we announced the license, we opened an expression of interest process, which is basically a selection process for companies that are invited to apply. They will have to fill answers to something like 100 different questions, very technical, looking at the capacity, financial stability, track record for quality, the footprint, and their capacity, their plan, what they intend to do in what time, in which country. So based on this, we will do an assessment. This will be blinded, and so we don't know which companies we're looking at. We have an internal team doing this and an external team of experts. And after that assessment, we will come up with a list of 3 manufacturers that we will mutually agree, that they take the license, and they will eventually sign that. We foresee this to happen by, let's say, around November, but of course it's something that we don't exactly know the end date, because we know when the application process ends, which is the beginning of September, and then we have to review. It depends how many we get, and also, but we know we can do this fast. So for example, in COVID, we've done it in, from announcement to first licensing, like 2-3 months max. So we can speed up things. After that, the companies will get started on developing, and they will have that permission from the license. And we foresee that this could take between 3 and 5 years. It really depends on which companies, what they have to invest, new infrastructure. But for dolutegravir, it's taken 3.5 years. Potentially this product is a bit more complex, but we can speed up things now, learning from COVID. But of course, while we learn from COVID and go faster, this is a long-acting product. So some of the studies or the bioequivalent studies for regulatory approval might be a bit longer, because the product has a half-life that's longer. So perhaps in 4 years, we might have something close to entry for generic competition.
Great, thank you. And just following up on some of what you explained, so the proposal review process, that timeline is really informed by past experience, or is there is that the standard time for review for any type of generic, licensing agreement? So that's a question we've actually received on the sidelines of the conference and online. So wanted to ask that. And then we've heard repeatedly that manufacturing CAB is complex. So could you talk a little bit more about what makes it more complex?
Sure, and Sean can add to that. So the timeline in the past may have been a bit longer than what we foresee for now, but we've done it much faster with COVID. So there are ways to accelerate for that timeline of selection. We don't foresee that we will get hundreds of applications also, because it's a complex product. It's not something that all generic manufacturers can do, but we know that there are many that will be able to do it. So we're not concerned about that, but we won't have hundreds of applications like literally what we had for COVID. So that's for the this timeline. And then in terms of the complexity, there's 2 or 3 elements. So first of all, it's an injectable. There needs to be manufacturing processes that have a sterile environment. There's a sterilization process that's called gamma ray irradiation. So this is basically a way to sterilize the liquids that will be put in the vials. There's, I think, 2 steps of this. And there's another thing that you will hear this word, it's nanomilling. It's basically to create the nanoparticles that will be in the suspension that's in the liquid. So the liquid, it's not soluble per se. These are like really tiny particles, and they are in suspension in the liquid. And then to do that, you need a very specialized piece of equipment that needs to be calibrated. That's quite expensive, and then many companies might not have. But it's just a matter of investing in the infrastructure. And so some companies might be able to do it on their own, or some might need some kind of support, some incentives, some de-risking investment from global health organizations. And we're looking at this with the coalition that was announced earlier this week with UNITAID, UNAIDS, WHO, and Global Fund leading, and EVAC also being involved, to look at this as part of the bigger picture of things that need to happen now for having the product in 4 years. And I don't know, Sean, if you want to add anything to that.
I think you've covered it really well. I think often a question we also get from community groups is, why are you only selecting 2 or 3? And I think you started answering part of it, but it might be helpful if you answer a bit more in terms of why only 2 or 3.
Sure. So for every product, there's always been an estimation of how many generic manufacturers we want. In COVID, we've been going very broadly. These are a bit more simple molecules to develop. And also there was a big push for having very dispersed local production because of barriers to exportation of these kind of things that, lockdowns. And so that's very specific. In HIV, sometimes we've had a few, sometimes we've had many manufacturers. It really depends on the market size. But here, it's a bit different. So normally when we have a very large number, there might be a couple of the manufacturers that don't make it to the end, and it's fine. It's a competition. They need to go fast, and the first that comes in will be rewarded in some ways by the market. And so that's what drives speed and reduction of prices. For cab, it's a bit different because we know the market is a bit uncertain. It's a bit more complex product. Select up to 3 manufacturers. So normally it should be 3, but we will make sure that they all come to the finish line with a lot of, being very careful into which one we select. And that balance is basically the market size, the uncertainty. So we don't want too many because then it's difficult for them to be able to have a sustainable business. And on the other hand, we want at least 3 because we need competition. Without competition, it doesn't change anything. So that's really important.
Thank you. And thank you to those of you who have joined us. Please feel free to take a seat, and just wanted to open it up for any questions based on what we discussed around voluntary licensing and manufacturing. So any questions?
Thank you both so much. Sebastian, at the beginning, you were mentioning that one of the things that goes into the selection process for which medicines you'll put forth a voluntary license for depends on public health need and what the community wants. So I was just wondering if either or both of you could talk about how you determine that public health need, or how you engage communities in determining those products that you want to apply a voluntary approval for.
Yeah, again, I think Sean can add to that from the perspective of the companies. But so the first step at MPP for when we start looking into licensing for specific medicines is we have a prioritization framework. So basically, it looks at what's the burden in terms of disease. Then, okay, this disease is a big burden. There's a need. Maybe the standard of care is not high, good enough, not optimum. What's the pipeline of drugs or drugs that are on the market just recently? And so we try to evaluate that from the public health perspective. And then there's a patent, which is basically the model that we explain is works when drugs are patented. So there needs to be some kind of patenting that's there for us to be making a difference. And normally the products will take a few years to get developed. So, we look at the length of the development compared to the patent. If we don't change anything, then we might prioritize something else, right? And so in this process, we are interacting with a lot of stakeholders. WHO, of course, guidelines, essential medicines list, the kind of pipeline reviews that they have, like in HIV, the CADO and PADO processes for adult and pediatric HIV medicines. But also we interact with scientists, experts across the world. So people who are clinicians, researchers, and others, and the community as well. So sometimes it's informal, and now we're trying to formalize it. And my colleague Mila, who's here in blue, is leading the development of our community advisory panel. And so this panel will be able to feed in information on an ad hoc basis for us to be able to a bit more formally follow and identify parties, but also they will be involved in the process. That's when we kind of assess whether a licensing agreement that's still in a draft is going far enough, is in making a difference. And so we have an expert advisory group that is doing this assessment and recommends, makes recommendations to our board that will eventually decide. And in that group, it's law experts, business experts, economics, public health experts, none disease specific necessarily, but the scientific advisory panel that we have and the community advisory panel that we are creating will be able to feed in community and scientists very specifically for the disease that we're looking at, 2 or 3 of them for each conversation. And so they will be able to have this impact there and bring their perspective. So for cabotegravir, I think we've heard from community from a long time that it was important. generics too were approaching us. They were, they also do this kind of mapping. So, and we've had prioritized it for a number of years, but there were uncertainties. It was still in the pipeline. That's a bit more challenging when you still don't know what's going to be the use and how big a change it's going to make. But then, what really triggered the speed up and acceleration of these conversations with the FDA approval and everything that's happened in the last year now.
For Vive Healthcare, we have access to medicine policy, which is available on our website. And it's the first time that the company's getting involved in an HIV prevention product, because our pipeline has always been HIV treatment products. And we've always been committed to ensuring that as many people as possible have access to antiretrovirals, and have always done that through a voluntary license for our HIV treatments. We're now doing the same for the HIV prevention product. The company also has community advisory boards, community advisory structures, particularly when it comes to pipeline and consulting with patient groups or patient advisory groups in commercial countries and non-commercial countries as well, in terms of trying to keep in touch with them as to what types of treatments is better for them, what do they think they're going to need, what is going to be more helpful for them, whether it's solid dose or injectable. So those consultations happen constantly. And then our collaboration with MPP is also an opportunity to ensure that the community voice is reflected in both the MPP and in Vive Healthcare.
Thank you. And we have a question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Tabani. I am a research fellow with the University of Toronto. My research focuses on HIV treatment adherence among children living with perinatal infection. But it's my follow-up. My question is a follow-up to what the previous person asked, which is, can you please say more about the composition of the community advisory boards? Like, who are the people represented in those spaces? Thank you.
Definitely. And I'll also pass it to perhaps Mila to talk a little bit more about the community advisory panel MPP talked about, to talk about that process and where you all are. But
it's a useful question. So it all depends on which country it is, but the majority of community advisory structures are made up of people living with HIV from the local community, and also a cross spectrum of people, so that they are representative of the patient groups. So if it's a straight men, cisgender women, trans men, trans women, it all just depends on what the purpose of the community advisory board is, and also the structure. And then we also engage with a number of existing stakeholder groups, such as AfroCab. And AfroCab is made up of people living with and affected by HIV, but they all community activists, advocates, very much involved in frontline work, very much involved in advocating with their governments, interacting with their governments, and they aren't afraid to keep us honest. And I think that that is probably the most important element of the advisory structures, is the accountability element.
Yeah, maybe I think the last point was very important for Cabotegravir. That was very key. So the community groups, and there were many of them, were very vocal that they wanted this to happen. And so that's what really got us to be so motivated to make it by this conference, because we knew that there was a very big excitement about this product that could be making a difference. And the license, it's just the beginning. There's lots of, there's lots of steps after that. And it's going to take, as I mentioned, a couple of years before it gets on the market. So we had to not waste time before that, so things can get started. But perhaps I can give the mic to Mila, so she can say a bit about the advisory panel we're setting up.
Thank you. I will be just very brief. So it's, yeah, first of all, we used to work with communities on a regular basis since the very beginning. So, and we engaged with community like at national, regional and international level. One of the ways we do it is through participating in community advisory board meetings. Like we are invited, for example, by CABs, they're called Community Advisory Board in every region, like to present on specific licenses or on MPP work in general. Plus we go, we are invited to some regional or local conference or international. So we try to engage with community as much as possible. And now we are establishing this community advisory panel, MPP advisory panel, just to be in touch with community on more regular basis. And also because we are expanded our mandate, we need community representatives in all disease areas that we work is, like HIV, viral hepatitis, TB, malaria, cancer, diabetes, also COVID-19, maternal and newborn health, child health. And of course, as soon as we prioritize more diseases to work in, like we will need more community representatives. And we try to involve community representatives from every region and of course for every disease areas. So people with lived experience with these diseases. So please get in touch with me. I will give you my contacts and I would be happy to discuss further, and if needed, we can organize a separate call on this, like to talk more about how to engage and about the process. The call is open, so is already open, so people can apply till September 16. So please feel free to contact me. I would be happy to discuss in more detail. And after the meeting as well, or if you have questions now, we can discuss now. Like,
Any other questions from the audience? Sure.
I'll just be interested in hearing from Sean. I mean, this is a product that's already begun to be rolled out by ViiV in some countries and it's preparing to roll it out in others. I'm just wondering, what kinds of challenges are you seeing in relation to the actual uptake and interest from the communities? And I hear it's the importance of choice. And do you have a sense of the extent to which different key populations or different communities might be interested in this as an important choice, and why? I mean, and I'd like to hear from others as well, but definitely also from you.
There is huge expectation and excitement about the product. I think part of the biggest challenge is managing expectations as to when the product is going to be available. Because I think even with the issue of the voluntary license, not all community members understand that it's still going to take 3 to 5 years to get a generic product available. People want the product now. When we engage with community members in the 084 countries, they're beginning to work with their government in terms of ensuring that the government understands that the products are going to become available, advocating around ensuring that it is in their budgets and that it is prioritized in their budgets. And importantly, also advocating with Global Fund and PEPFAR, who for the majority of the countries are probably going to pay for it initially. So what we do need to do is to constantly emphasize what is ViiV's role, what is MPP's role, but importantly, what is the role of community advocates on the ground. Because we anticipate that the registration will come through end of this year, maybe next year in one of those 084 countries. But if one of those countries approves next week or next month, which is also quite possible, I don't think we're going to be ready for that. And ensuring that communities create awareness and excitement and prevention literacy, and ensuring that it is understood as a choice and an option and advocating for it as a choice and an option is incredibly exciting. And there are huge amounts of community groups who are doing excellent work around creating that awareness. But we need to support them even more to be able to do that in a more sustainable way.
Thank you so much. And I know that Viva is also embarking on a couple of implementation science projects in the US. I'm not sure if you can share a bit more about that and if the timelines for that, as those lessons might be more available sooner than.
So part of the what they call open label extensions is having a look at implementation science studies. So trying to answer the questions around implementation in the real world setting. So there are a number of studies being done in the US, but also in other countries such as Brazil, potentially Kenya, and Zimbabwe, which is looking at other population groups or trying to answer particular issues around access or acceptability within these population groups. The information on our implementation science studies is available on our website as well. Because I think that one of the things that we have understood and realized is that it is critically important to make information available and be transparent about the information upfront so that people are well informed about that. I see you have a question.
Of course, because you mentioned Zimbabwe, that's where I come from. But I'm interested in the implementation science studies. Are these studies completed or are they in the process? And also, just in general, I know I will have to check the website, but what are the populations that we are focusing on, particularly in the US and in Zimbabwe? Like, just in general, what are the specific population groups of interest?
In the US, we are focusing on African American men who have sex with men, because they were a very large population in the 083 studies, and also looking at transgender women who have sex with men. In Zimbabwe at the moment, it is looking at adolescents and young women, and we're also looking at women who are involved in sex work in order to try and understand acceptability and use and implementation challenges around producing it. All trial participants continue to get access of the product in the implementation science studies and in the OLE studies. The implementation science studies aren't paid for by ViiV. They're paid for by donors or by other sponsors like the Gates Foundation or USAID. And all ViiV does is to provide the product, and then also ensures that the scientific merits of the study meet all the requirements, etc.
Thank you. Any follow-up to that or? Oh, sure, sure. I did unfortunately, one of our colleagues, Patricia Jaconia from LVCT, who's based in Kenya and has a wealth of experience implementing PrEP programs, couldn't make it here today. And the reason why we invited her is because, generic access implementation science is just one piece of the puzzle. National guidelines, regulatory approval, thinking through delivery, provider training. I mean, there's a whole cascade of steps that need to happen to really ensure that CAB is scaled up and available to as many populations as possible. So, I wonder though, if there's anyone here who would like to speak to some of those steps. And we do have a question online from Jim Pickett, who's really asking more about, can we estimate the timing of when CAB will be available and people will start using it? I know it's hard. There's a lot of sort of uncertainties and dependencies, but curious about the timing for that. And if you wanted to speak about the next steps and rollout.
I mean, the product is available, and it's only been licensed in the US at the moment. And so we have filed in all the 084 countries and are in the process of filing in the 083 countries. Until we get a generic, Vive Healthcare will be the sole supplier of the product, and we have committed to making the product available at a non-profit price. And that non-profit price isn't going to be as cheap as oral Truvada, oral PrEP, but we are talking about in the tens of dollars as opposed to in the hundreds of dollars. So when the product's actually going to get in the arms, because even if a country approves it tomorrow, from approval to actually getting it into the arms of people is going to take a very long time. And that's why we need community advocates and activists to ensure that that preparation starts to happen now, so that the Ministry of Health does begin to train the workers, so that the activists begin to support and educate the community about the product, so that there are appropriate places where the product can be made available. Because we know that oral PrEP, people do not want to go to an HIV clinic to get the product. So how is the product going to be distributed in country? And all these things still need to be figured out in countries. So the approval is only one step, but operationalizing everything is the responsibility of in-country partners. And we are very happy to work with those in-country partners. But we have to emphasize that it is the responsibility of in-country partners around that.
Absolutely. Sebastian,
Yeah, I just want to echo Sean, that there's an opportunity for advocacy right now to create the demand, to get countries ready. It's going to be very country specific. In some instances with PEPFAR and Global Fund, there might be waivers for regulatory approval that can speed up some of the parts of the processes. But there's two big steps, right? We foresee the generic entry in 3, 4, 5 years, but until then we need to ramp up. We don't want to start when they come. We want to be ready, and so we can really be almost at scale or really in that phase where things can accelerate. And in countries where there's oral PrEP already, there might be infrastructure and already some kind of awareness of these products. But in other countries where oral PrEP is not even available, that might be a first step that's important to get to organize the infrastructure, get the awareness, get the policy changes. The WHO has published the guidelines for CAB-LA, and now countries should start looking at implementing those. We know that some countries are doing that, but that's another important step. And then the other thing is, of course, Sean has mentioned the countries where there will be registration for, the countries from the studies where registration is happening, or filing will happen soon. But there will be a much larger number of countries where this needs to happen. And of course, the large procurement agencies, PEPFAR and Global Fund, are looking at trying to map out which ones we should focus on first, based on the biggest impact this can have, biggest burden, biggest incidents, and where countries might be ready. And so to make sure that there's coordination with VIV, of course, as MPP, we're not really involved in that, but we know that this is really key for when the generics will come on board, so that also for generics, they know that they have to go fast, because the faster they go, the faster they get the business, and the fastest people get this price decrease. And it's all kind of interlinked. So if we are bold right now with the originator product, we can be much bolder, much more rapidly, with the generic when they're ready.
absolutely. And I think that's a really great point about countries that do not have well-established oral PrEP programs yet. And to really invest the time and money now to build those up, and communities can advocate for that. And I just wanted to bring back to the point, because there was a follow-up question: what can communities do now in order to prepare for when CAB is available? And I think the point around demand generation is I just wanted to reiterate that, because what we've seen with oral PrEP is still 10 years later. There's such low awareness, not only of oral PrEP, but of HIV prevention in general. And so given that CAB will sort of be offered as an option and as a choice alongside PrEP and hopefully the ring and other products, it's really important to create that general awareness of HIV prevention services that are available. And I'm just struck by so many studies that still say that awareness and knowledge are quite low. And that how to really dismantle stigma and because people are seeking PrEP who are relatively healthy. So there's an extra motivation and support from the community, from their peers that's needed to really make that decision, I think. And I think that can be somewhat underestimated. Yes. And I think there was a question that's followed up about demand generation. How long do you actually create demand? And if there's no product, that can be frustrating. And so how do you manage those expectations? Again, I think Sean, you mentioned that, but do you want to expand a little bit about how to balance that?
Sure. I mean, I think it was in the prevention plenary where, and he just happened to walk in where Mitchell indicated that oral PrEP, there's only 3 million people who have had access to oral PrEP in the last 10 years. And that's our collective failure. That's the demand for oral PrEP is still so low and there's such a low uptake. I think many of the community stakeholders that we speak with and engage with around creating demand, it is an issue. How do we get communities excited about the products when the product isn't even available? It is a careful balancing act because we do want to ensure that all the requirements are in place. So all the healthcare providers are trained, there's sufficient resources. And as soon as we are able to give communities greater clarity around timelines, particularly around once it's approved in country, it becomes easier, I think, to galvanize that excitement. But we can't do anything until that approval happens in a country. And once that has happened, the communities can certainly become a lot more engaged and a lot more involved. But it is a very fine balancing act because you saying this product is good, this product is available, but you can't get your hands on it. So the sooner we're able to speed up the timelines, the better it is going to be.
Absolutely. And really distinguishing between creating demand for a product versus HIV prevention in general, which is available. Yeah. Great. We have a question from the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but this is my last question, I think. And it was a follow-up to the question on stigma. We already know that the difference, the challenges between availability and access have a lot to do with a lot of things, stigma, weak public health systems, and stuff like that. Some of the things we have mentioned. But I work with adolescents, and one of my questions is, we already know that they're already having challenges accessing condoms because of sexual stigma. The perception that they don't want to be seen or they are not expected to be having sex. So is there anything either in your studies or in your initiatives that is being done to prepare the ground that we don't reproduce similar challenges with gaps in uptakes because other population groups already have existing problems in terms of engaging healthcare systems on sexual health products or sort of?
Another very good question. So please keep the questions coming. I think it's a very relevant question. I think one of the challenges that we saw around oral PrEP when it was introduced in our part of the world, which I come from South Africa, is that oral PrEP was aimed at key populations, so sex workers and gay men. And so it almost has been tarnished as a product only for key population. So if you're a sex worker or a gay man. So I think we are trying to learn the lessons when it comes to long acting. And of course, there are issues around underage children being adolescents being sexually active, and how do they access products. It is an issue which we are looking at in some of the implementation science studies. But of course, we are guided by what the age of consent is in a particular country, because we need to be aligned to that. But we know that adolescents have sex at a very young age. So if we are able to ensure that they have access to a product which is going to prevent them from contracting HIV, that is the primary aim. But the Mosaic consortium that we were talking about earlier on is having a look at some of these challenges and some of the issues around access, removing the issue of stigma, how the product is introduced into a clinic run by key populations, or at a hospital clinic or family planning clinic. And there were quite a few presentations at this conference, and the most effective way it currently seems as to how oral PrEP is getting out is a number of distribution channels. So if we look at Vietnam and Kenya, it's private pharmacy, it's online, it's KP run clinics, and they all have different options. So it comes back to options, and choice.
As choice in terms of delivery, not just the products. And just to add to your question, which is a brilliant one, AVAC with partners conducted end user research in South Africa, which showed that especially for adolescent girls and young women, they're much more concerned about maintaining their relationships, about empowerment. And so really framing for providers and for demand generation efforts to frame HIV in the context, start with relationships, start with empowerment, don't start with risk. I think those are some of the lessons that we've learned, and who's providing that information, I think, is important, and where that information is provided. So in safe spaces with peers, where adolescents can feel ready to start using a product like oral PrEP, like CAB, like the ring, and investing that time and in building for providers to build that relationship. And again, as much as possible, integrating it with sexual and reproductive health services, with family planning, I think is really important for adolescent girls and young women. Pregnancy prevention is more top of mind than HIV prevention for most young women. And so the more that we can integrate those services, I think the greater uptake and sustained use we'll see. So just wanted to add that. We have another question from our online participants. Okay, question about nomenclature. Long acting is language that is somewhat rejected by the contraceptive community regarding CAB for PrEP. They note that 2 months is not considered long acting in the contraceptive field. Any thoughts about dropping long acting and replacing with longer acting or injectable PrEP?
Interesting question. Ultimately, I think what would be ideal is that we are able to offer CAB on a 3-monthly or 4-monthly or 5-monthly dose. So that's also something that we are busy looking at. Because we know that many women in sub-Saharan Africa prefer long-acting contraceptives, and currently the contraceptive is once every 3 months. So you can imagine the ideal scenario: if a woman goes to a family planning clinic, she gets a contraceptive, at the same time she also gets her prevention option. So that is the important element. I think I don't think we've given much thought to dropping the term long acting, because hopefully it is going to become long acting. I think the important issue is that people understand what the product is and what the product can do. I don't know if you've got it.
Yeah, perhaps just to add that No, I think it's quite early for long-acting space. There's, you know, there's going to be improvement as Sean mentioned. There's also in the pipeline other products, like for example for PrEP, this lenacapavir long-acting, which is 6 months. Let's see if that works well. But you know, of course, it's nothing compared to contraception space, right? But I think for HIV, it does speak to people because the comparison is a daily acting. So.
Great. I think we're at the top of the hour, so just wanted to thank both Sean and Sebastian for being here with us and for sharing more details on licensing, on community engagement, on the next steps in order to ensure that CAB is truly affordable and accessible and available in the next few years, and hopefully sooner than that. So any last comments before we wrap up?
It is a truly exciting moment in the HIV response, and we can't screw this up. And so as Vive Healthcare, we are really dependent on community stakeholders to help us make this a success, because we can't come back in 10 years' time and say only X million of people access the product. So we look forward to working with you all.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you know, the time to act now is now for everyone, community in particular, and governments and civil society. And this is just the beginning, right? The train is leaving the station, but there's a long way ahead, and it's very exciting because, you know, it seems like this momentum has been created and everything is coming together. So thanks for organizing that discussion.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.